Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for hanging on in there for the last session on a Friday. Thanks very much, Anne-Marie, and also to Task and FEPS for organising today. And they've been excellent speakers this morning, so hopefully you can keep up the quality. So we've been asked to look at the idea of promoting good jobs in Ireland and Europe, and I'm going to primarily talk about the Irish context with a small bit of commentary maybe on Europe. And I'm going to focus on some commentary on public policy with regards to the quality of work in Ireland and issues with regard to regulation and what's coming down the track in terms of proposed government policy with regards to quality of work. And I suppose what we're looking at was how do we improve, what is the state of the quality of jobs in Ireland and how are we going to improve the quality? And quality, of course, has been a big issue, particularly since the crisis. And we've heard earlier about how bodies like the OECD are talking about inequality, and the European Commission is talking about inclusive growth and a fair European Commission. They've been talking a lot about this since last year. A sort of recognition that jobs need to be better or good in some way to be able to improve growth and improve the welfare for individuals. So that's what we're going to focus on for the moment is quality. And for quite a long time, we tend to focus only on wages when we talked about jobs and trying to identify good versus bad jobs. And luckily, that research is widening, and James and Alicia's studies contributing to that. And looking at broader measures of jobs that don't just take into account wages. So what I've done first is try and take just a quick snapshot of one study on job quality. Now, Donald from Eurofound can talk about, I'm sure, reference other studies that Eurofound have done, and they've done a lot in the last couple of years. And they also look at similar measures of job quality across Europe. So in looking at that, I mentioned, like I said, public policy, employment law, and also something about narrative, so about jobs in Ireland. And this will touch a lot on the things that Patricia King and James talked about earlier. So if we're going to look at job quality, this is a study I mentioned by David Holman 2 years ago, and he's done similar work to what Eurofound have done, and they've based studies on the European Working Conditions Survey. And this is Holman's analysis of the European Working Conditions Survey from 2005. So we're talking about pre-crisis here. And he has developed measures of job quality based on the survey. And basically what he's done is that he's divided jobs up into 6 different types of jobs based on their quality. And job quality is generally taken to mean the factors of a job that lead to job satisfaction and psychological and physical well-being for an employee. Never mind, of course, all the other good things that come from good job quality, like economic and societal benefits. But we're talking just a moment about the employee effects. And he's divided jobs into high-quality jobs, moderate jobs, and low-quality jobs. And he's taken a snapshot in 2005 of different countries in Europe. And what you can easily see there is that Ireland doesn't fare particularly well when we compare ourselves to social democratic and continental countries, but we fare better than Southern European and Central and Eastern European countries. And when he's talking about job quality, what he's talking about are things like the way a job is organised, the type of job discretion or level of job discretion that somebody has in a job, working time flexibility, job security, the type of contract that somebody has, the level of training and skills in a job, wages, the way people are paid, and engagement level with employees. So all measures are in the European Working Conditions Survey. So he's estimated that about 45% of jobs in Ireland are considered either high or moderate quality jobs, which are fairly decent in terms of wages, security, and working time flexibility. But then we have 55% which would be considered low quality jobs. And as you might imagine, given discussions earlier, in social democratic countries like Sweden and Finland, you'll find low proportions of low-quality jobs and high proportions of high-quality jobs. In contrast, in the Southern European and Central East European countries, it's vice versa. You have higher proportions of lower quality jobs and lower proportions of high quality jobs. What you find in Ireland is that basically across the different types of quality jobs, you have a fairly even level across quality. So we have fairly even levels of high quality, moderate quality and low quality jobs. Now, there's one type of job quality where there is an outlier in Ireland, which is a very poor one, and that is in relation to insecure jobs. So I've just taken 2 of the types of jobs that Holman mentions. And the insecure job is the type of job that we stereotypically associate as being precarious. It is the low-paid, low security, low level of training and skills job. And as you can see here, Ireland fares worse than all the other employment regimes when it comes to insecure jobs. There are other types of poor quality jobs that he mentions, but insecure jobs is the only one with those three features of low pay, low security, low training. So pretty poor quality overall, low working time flexibility. The other one to compare it to is the active job, and the active job is the one that Holman considers the best. It's the one which is the highest quality job. It's good pay, good training and development skills, good engagement with employees, high security, good working time flexibility from the employee's perspective, standard hours of work. And Ireland doesn't fare particularly well in comparison to especially even UK and social democratic and continental countries when it comes to those types of jobs. So that just sets some of the context. And I'll talk about the survey later on when we talk about the narrative. So it's already been mentioned already, the level of low-wage jobs in Ireland. And of course, James has already alluded to, and Patricia as well, to the importance of the retail and accommodation and food sectors. And that sector, those two sectors are extremely important for a number of reasons. One is the level of employment that they have, two, the level of low pay that they have, and the third one, of course, is their low level of unionisation. Now, typically, the way in which other countries in Europe try to lower the levels of low pay is either you constrain the amount of employment that there is in low-paying sectors, like hotels and accommodation, or else you try and regulate those low-paying sectors pretty well. Now, the difficulty with Ireland is that we've problems on both counts. We've pretty high dependency on retail and accommodation and the hospitality sector in terms of employment, and there are also sectors which have pretty high levels of low pay. So accommodation and retail account for about 20% of employees in the country, and of course if you're just looking at private sector employment, it's higher again. And I've just taken some research that Michael Taft has done recently on Indigenous Irish employment. And he's looked at, well, where is Irish Indigenous employment located in terms of sectors? And what he's shown here is that if you look at retail and hospitality as a percentage of total Indigenous employment in Ireland, that Ireland has much greater dependency on those sectors than in the EU 15 or other small open economies. So we're pretty dependent on those sectors. And as mentioned, we also have pretty high levels of low pay in those sectors. So this is research myself and my colleague Tom Turner did in 2013, which was related to the Joint Labour Committee system that Patricia mentioned earlier. And we looked at, well, where are the people who are paid Joint Labour Committee pay rates that were set at the time. And as we can see that even though retail and hospitality on the right-hand column accounted together for about 30% of all private sector employees, they accounted for half of all low-paid people who were paid the type of rates that were set by joint labour committees. So they disproportionately account for low pay. They also disproportionately account for lower hours, which was mentioned earlier. Accommodation and hotels, or accommodation and food in particular, has a very high, disproportionate high amount of variable hours. People who work constantly variable hours that they cannot say from one week to the next what their hours will be. And then both sectors have a disproportionate number of low hours, regular low hours from 1 to 35 hours that people work. And what we can see from research that was done in the recent years by NERI is that hotels and accommodation in particular have had the most drastic fall in average working hours since the early 1990s. And in comparison to lots of the other sectors, with the exception of agriculture, in many other sectors since the 1990s, there's been a steady but stable decline in working hours in recent years, whereas hotels and restaurants have had a pretty dramatic decline in average working hours. It's already been mentioned as well about the state supports. Patricia King alluded to it, about the supports that are available to people who are on low working incomes. It's already been mentioned about the significant work that social welfare system has to do to be able to reduce poverty levels, and the Gini coefficient was mentioned earlier. And we can see that there's been a significant increase in the number of families who have been accessing family income supplement. And family income supplement was originally set up to support people on full-time hours. Now, that was originally for people around, who were getting 35 hours per week. Social welfare has dropped the number of hours, so now you can access family income supplement if you're getting more than 19 hours per week. There's a whole range of factors for why the number of families is increasing, but it's increasing, and it's an increasing cost to the state. So in 2014, family income supplements cost the state €280 million. And the Department of Social Protection has expressed concern about this and questioned the sustainability of these types of payments. In addition to the 50,000 families in 2014 on FIS, we also have an additional 65,000 people who are termed casuals by the Department of Social Protection, who are really part-time workers, who've had to also supplement their incomes through job seekers' benefit and allowance. And one of the things that James mentioned was the idea of control of working hours by employers. And this was something that came up a lot in our study on 0 hours contracts last year, that not only are employers exerting control over working hours schedules, but that this becomes a much more important issue when you have people who are trying to get 19 hours per week to be able to access family income supplement, or who are trying to schedule their hours over 3 days in a week in order to be able to access job seekers' benefit or allowance. So control there becomes a much of greater importance to those people when they need a particular number of pattern hours to be able to access social welfare. So what are we saying at the end of all this? Well, what we're saying is that we have a problem with job quality according to the data that we have so far. We know we've significant levels of low wage employment. We've significant costs to states in terms of state supports. So, what's the current plan that the government has in terms of trying to resolve some of these issues? Well, the current programme for partnership government, or whatever it's called, has talked about supporting an increase in the national minimum wage from what's currently €9.15 to €10.50 within the next 5 years, which is a good thing. We know all the studies there are about the effects of increases in minimum wages and that people spend it and so on. But it's still under the current threshold for low pay. So depending on which research study you look at, if we take the NERI one recently, they defined low pay as being the threshold of $12.20 per hour. So it's still a low pay that's anticipated to be set for the minimum wage, even if that happens over 5 years' time. But at the same time, the programme also states that they're going to plan to cut employers' PRSI to compensate for the fact that they plan for an increase in the minimum wage. And they say that they're going to do this to be able to protect jobs. So there's an assumption there by the people who've written this document that if they increase the minimum wage to €10.50, there's going to be a cost on jobs without any, or will lead to some kind of loss of jobs, without any analysis of that happening, or without any regard for the previous studies that have been done in the States, the UK and Ireland about how the minimum wage doesn't have anywhere near the supposed effects on employment loss there has been. And of course, that's worrying on a number of reasons about the cut in employers' PRSI. One, because Michael Taft has talked frequently about the fact that Ireland has one of the lowest rates of employers' PRSI contributions in the EU, that it's currently half the EU average of what employers pay in terms of social insurance contributions. And second of all, there is also concern that when the government did this already, the government already cut employers' social insurance contributions for 2 years in 2011. So they cut employers' social insurance contributions from 8.5% to over 4% for low-paying jobs, for anyone earning less than €352 per week. And they did this with a specific aim to incentivise job growth. And the Department of Social Protection itself has said that there's anecdotal concerns expressed to them that this led to job splitting, that one job was split into 2 low-paying jobs when employers' social insurance contribution was cut. And they note themselves that there's indications from the data that they have that this is a possible explanation for what happened, but they can't say because the government never did any study about what was the effect on jobs by cutting employers' PRSI. So it's extremely concerning that this is already the plan in place when there's been no analysis of the effect of this for the state. Never mind the fact that it's obviously going to put things back to square one. What's the point in increasing minimum wage in terms of improving the quality of jobs when you at the same time decrease employers' social contribution? In addition to that, they also talk about increasing state supports for low hours workers. So we're still talking about keeping a significant dependence on the state to improve people's lives without any real plan to improve the quality of jobs themselves. And the last thing that's mentioned in the programme for government, because it's quite scant in the area of labour market regulation, is that they're going to strengthen the regulation of precarious work without any further detail as to what that means. So let's talk for a minute about the regulation of precarious work. There's two overarching problems with employment law in Ireland. People can give out about it in lots of different contexts. But the two overarching problems is that, one, it has a common problem with other countries in that it doesn't currently keep pace with what's happening in the labour market. The European Commission in 2006, and they reiterated this a number of times, including last year, have said that labour law has not kept pace with the changing forms of employment being offered to people and the types of contracts that people are being offered, like bogus self-employment, like all these gig economy type, Uber type contracts. And also as well, I suppose an area of particular interest and concern to me is in the area of the 0 hours work. And I suppose I'll make explicit reference to the report that we did last year on 0 hours, and to our finding that there's evidence of if and when contracts being used, and Patricia already mentioned their particular prevalence in the hospitality sector. And just to explain briefly what these are, if and when contracts are the exact same thing as 0 hour contracts in the UK. They are no different. They are just a different name for a 0 hours contract that's happening in the UK. And what they mean is that someone does not have any guaranteed hours of work, but neither is an employee obliged to be given any work. And in theory, they can accept or reject any work offered. But of course, we know that that's a very simplistic idea, that people can just accept or reject work when they may not have very little options. The difficulty with this is that these are exactly the type of people that labour law has not kept pace with. And the difficulty is that in order for you to be categorised as an employee in most labour law systems, there has to be an obligation on an employer to give you work, and there has to be an obligation on an employee to do work. That obligation from both sides doesn't exist with someone who doesn't have guaranteed hours, like under an if and when contract. So what are they? They're not employees. They're not independent contractors. So we don't know what they are. Now in Ireland, we don't have a worker status, which is somewhere between an employee and an independent contractor. It's mentioned in a number of pieces of legislation, the Minimum Wage Act, the equality legislation, but in general, we don't have the status of worker, which is somewhere in the middle. And we're not advocating it. The UK has it. It has created its own sets of problems, so it's a difficulty there. And a typical example of the difficulties that this creates, in the last couple of weeks, there has been a case in the UK, Windle, which has been going around the houses in the UK in terms of tribunals and courts of appeal. And it involves two people who are on the equivalent of if and when contracts. And the reason why the UK case law is important is because the Labour Court here and the courts here, when looking at these types of contracts, have used UK case law. And they can't decide in the UK yet if two people on if and when contracts are covered by equality legislation or not, because they can't decide if they're employees or not. They know they're not employees, but they're not sure if they're workers. So the way the legislation now is developed is this ludicrous situation where David, for example, who might be on an if and when contract, he might be called into work on a Monday morning for 4 hours. During that time, he is categorised as a worker for the 4 hours that he works on a Monday. But as soon as he stops working, he's nothing. He's not a worker, he's not an employee, he's not a contractor. He has no rights at all when he's not working. So he has some rights when he is working for a couple of hours in a day, and then no rights as soon as he leaves work. Now they're not even sure if that's the case in the last couple of weeks. So the case is still ongoing as to, well, do they have rights of work at all, even when they turn up for work? So this is the kind of crazy complexity now and grey zones that the European Commission has referred to when we talked about the labour law not keeping pace. And we made a whole series of recommendations to try and solve some of these problems. And in particular, we made a recommendation that there should be minimum guaranteed hours for someone after 6 months of employment, which should be some kind of realistic depiction of what they've been doing for the first 6 months. And this would solve two problems to some extent. One, it gives people a predictable number of hours, we hope, for a period of time, but also it means that their employment status is clarified. As soon as you give people some minimum guaranteed hours work, they're automatically part-time employees. They're not in the grey zone any longer. So they're definitely employees, and that's what that recommendation was meant to try and resolve. There's other recommendations there as well, which are explained in more detail in the report, which we don't really have time to go into at the moment. But these two last ones are important, that if it's a case that a government doesn't decide to provide for legislation to give guaranteed minimum hours of work for people, then they have to do something about employment status. They have to do something about saying, who are these people on if and when contracts? Are they employees or what are they? And what kind of rights do they have? Because at the moment, there's a very strong case that they have extremely few legal rights available to them. The last issue mentioned there is CSO data. Now, it's fantastic that, again, we've James and Lisa study to be able to add to what's going on in reality in the labour market. And also we have the European Working Conditions Survey. I suppose that the one limitation of the European Working Conditions Survey, the major benefit is that it's a European-wide survey. And the second benefit is that it has very good measures of job quality. The limitation is that within a country, the sample is much smaller than what we would like for a big study that, for example, the Quarterly National Household Survey or so on. And this is important because we need data to be able to say what's going on in the labour market. And the data in our CSO national studies hasn't kept pace either with what's going on in terms of non-guaranteed hours and job quality. And there's a reason why data is important, and that is to be able to examine the narrative. And James referred to this already, about the way in which flexible employment is presented to employees. So, Feminist Lister has been talking about this for a while, and James alluded to as well, that for a long time unions and employees are fighting for more flexible work. And now flexible work is being presented to people as being something which is good for them, when in fact it's just a guise for what is in reality precarious work, where you do have those insecure jobs of low pay, low quality jobs. So it's extremely important to be able to counteract this narrative that employees are in control of their hours, even in these if and when type contracts. The employees have flexibility and employees have choice. And I suppose there's two examples of where data is incredibly important. And again, just to refer to a previous research study from 2013. And if people remember who might have been keeping in touch with the story of the joint labour committees, I mean, the main argument employers made, particularly from hospitality, as to why joint labour committees were bad was because of overtime pay and Sunday premiums. So they said that overtime pay and Sunday premiums were excessive in those sectors and were costing lots of jobs. Yet when you do analysis of a CSO survey, the National Employment Survey, we find that according to the survey, a huge survey with 60,000 employees and 4,000 businesses, is that there's a very low level of overtime in the country, and even lower levels in those particular sectors, particularly retail and hospitality. And that if you look at employees, only about 1.6% of hours worked by employees in low-paid sectors constituted overtime. So in the absence of evidence, you have this narrative that it must be true, that it must be true, that if someone makes a statement, unless you have something to counteract it, that it becomes truth. And then public policy gets built on that narrative. And that's, of course, what happened, is that the government reintroduced joint labour committees, but then took away powers with regard to overtime and Sunday premiums. Similarly, if we talk about the idea of control of work, we have very little data from the CSO about employees' level of control, but the European Working Conditions Survey from 2005 shows that in the blue section there, that 3/4 of employees say that they have no input in regards to the hours that they have, and that it's the organisation which sets those hours. So we need better data in terms of job quality and what people do. A reference, I suppose, to the question that Micheál asked James later. I mean, we've no legislation really, or regulation, which says anything about people controlling their hours. And it's interesting that in other countries, this is a little bit different. So, for example, there is a provision in legislation in Norway that rosters should be consulted between an employer and the employee representative on site before they're approved, so that you have an employee representative who has some input into the way rosters look in an organisation. And we also know that people who have changes in working hours frequently have extremely little notice. Half of all employees who have frequent changes in their working hours get that notice either on the day or the day before. So we have significant problems there, not just with people's number of hours, but the control of their work. So no problem, okay. So this is all, of course, very cynical. I'm saying that, one of the problems of public policy is that we have a very haphazard public policy coming down the track in terms of how to improve quality of jobs. We know that retail is problematic. And in addition to that, what I should have mentioned also is that the programme for government also plans to increase employment in tourism by 25% within the next 9 years. Now, of course, it's fantastic that there's an increase in jobs and a potential increase in tourism spending. But at what cost? We're now saying that we're going to create 25% more jobs in a sector that we know is the lowest paying in the country. So what is that going to do in terms of the overall effect for the economy and society on job quality? So where are there potential options then for improvements in job quality? The Labour Party motion on workers' rights was mentioned earlier. There's a plethora of things there mentioned in terms of regulation of work, including in regard to if and when contracts. Again, I just want a note of caution here about language and narrative. It's extremely important that we be careful about the language in which we phrase regulation. So, for example, it's mentioned that there should be, I suppose it's good for ourselves to be able to say that they're promoting that the recommendations from the ZR's report to be introduced. At the same time, though, there's a line in the motion which says that they want to end the abuse of if and when contracts. Now, ending the abuse of if and when contract is not the same thing as saying ending if and when contracts. Ending the abuse of if and when contracts suggests that there are some if and when contracts are good and some if and when contracts are bad. Now, how do you then determine in sectors where there's low unionisation and low bargaining power for an individual that they have the choice to say, yes, I want an if and when contract because it's good for me? What kind of real choice is that? So policy makers have to be very careful in distinguishing policy and trying to say, yes, well, we don't want to exclude some people who might like them. But how are we supposed to detect who are those people who have real choice and who say that they want them? The second potential area where there might be some improvement in job quality is the European Pillar of Social Rights. And President Juncker and the European Commission has reiterated that there needs to be improvement in conditions of work. And they've set out a plan for the European Pillar of Social Rights, and this is going through a consultation process. And they've mentioned things like flexible contracts, wages, conditions of employment. But there's no real aspiration there about what a good quality job should look like within the European Union. For example, they mention in the section on conditions, they mention the dangers of flexible contracts and flexible conditions. They say on the one hand it can be good for people to enter the labour market, but also there's dangers attached to it. And for example, dangers attached to temporary work and that this can lead to precarious employment. But then bizarrely, when they get to a little bit more specifics, the only specifics that they mention in relation to improving the conditions of work are in relation to the level of the length of time someone's on probation for a job, that there should be a dispute resolution mechanism if someone is dismissed unfairly, and that there should be a statement of terms and conditions of employment. So after discussing this idea that job quality is important, there's problems with flexible employment, and then they come to kind of bizarre, really tangential elements of work like probation, which are nowhere near where the real problems of work lie. And it's really unlikely that it's going to have any significant impact, particularly in the Irish context, in terms of proving job quality, particularly because it's seen that at the moment it's unlikely that it'll have any legally binding nature at all to it. So I suppose there's some hope, I suppose, with the Labour Party motion in terms of at least discussions about forcing discussions on rights in the future, but it's difficult to see where it'll end up with lobbying and so forth hanging on in there. And really it's going to take a coordinated policy, public policy and political will. And as well as that, the old adage of evidence-based public policy, as opposed to what's happening now, typical in the programme for government, where we have a tendency in Irish governments to give a little bit to both sides. So there's a halfway house for everything. So we're going to increase the minimum wage, but we're also going to reduce the social insurance. So we're still left at the end where we started at the beginning. So apologies for the cynicism, but thank you very much.